Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We'll start in about a minute or two just to get everyone settled in and everyone to join. Good afternoon to those joining us right now. We're going to start about a minute or two, and then we'll begin. Good afternoon to those joining us. Welcome. We'll begin shortly. Welcome to those who are attending. We'll give everyone about a minute and then we'll start. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, we will begin and more people will be joining us. But let's start. Welcome, everyone. As always, we're delighted to have you all here today. My name is Bora, and I'm Assistant Director of Programs and Director of Studies at the Tower Center. A little bit about how today is going to go. I'll introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our speaker. And then after our speaker presents, we'll have a short moderated discussion and then followed by Q&A from you all. Please enter your questions in the chat so our moderator can ask them during the Q&A portion. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Hiroki Takeuchi. He will be moderating today's event and will also be taking your questions. He is a senior fellow at SMU Tower Center and director of the SMU Incentive Star Program on Japan and East Asia. Hiroki, I now turn it over to you.
Right, great. Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the second SoundStar webinar on Japan and East Asia. On behalf of the SMU Tower Center SoundStar program on Japan and East Asia, I thank Bora Lazzi and SMU Tower Center team led by Luisa del Rosal. On behalf of the SMU, I thank Japan Airlines for supporting SMU Tower Center and SMU in Japan program at Kansei Gakuin University. Today, we talk about Prime Minister Abe. Prime Minister Abe is, in many senses, interesting figure. Prime Minister Abe, those who may not be familiar with Japanese politics, has served as a Japanese Prime Minister for 8 years, from 2012 to 2020. And then that actually 8 years is the longest serving tenure in the Japanese political history. In fact, Japan has a reputation of Prime Minister having a very short term, and basically a Japanese Prime Minister, most of them stepped down after 1 year. So Abe was very unique in that sense. And then also Abe has achieved made a lot of achievements. So he is actually arguably the only leader of the major country in the world who had a good relationship with both Obama and Trump. And also he made concluded the Trans-Pacific Partnership even after United States under Trump administration withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Abe passed a very well, controversial but significant security legislation. And then that is highly praised with United States and US allies. So Abe seems like a very remarkable person, remarkable leader. However, this is actually puzzling. Those who have heard him speak, you would feel, once like Prime Minister Abe starts talking, you would feel either sleepy or frustrated. So definitely Abe's achievement is not because of his charisma. So why? And then actually he failed his administration. So he had to step down after 8 months of serving when he served as a prime minister as the first time from 2006 to 2007. So, so at that time, we thought that his term was over, his political life was over, but he was back later, and then he became the longest serving prime minister in Japan. So there are a lot of puzzling questions, and we have the best person to talk about why Abe was successful in the second term, how interesting he is. So today's speaker is Tobias Harris. Now I can say my old friend. We were together as members of the Mansfield Foundation Network for the Future. And we traveled to Japan together, attending the various meetings in Tokyo and Okinawa. So since then, we talk a lot about Japanese politics. I'm always impressed with his knowledge of Japanese politics, as well as his analysis. So I have learned a lot, so I'm very excited to have him. Before starting, let me share the flyer of his book. So he's talking about, by the way, before that, so let me introduce this book. So he's the author of this book, The Iconoclast, Shinzo Abe and New Japan. And you can see this is a very thick book, very big book. So he wrote about Abe for spending 500 pages. By the way, among those 500 pages, 100 pages is the end note. So this is academic book. So this is definitely the only English language biography of Prime Minister Abe. But I think I would say that the only, even including Japanese biography of Abe, I think this is the only academically sophisticated biography of Prime Minister Abe. So congratulations, Tobias. And then so he shared us he shared with us the flyer for the discount of this book. So let me share the screen. And then, so this is the PDF of the flyer of the book by Oxford University Press. So here is the code. So please take note, and then you can enjoy the 30% discount. So, so without further ado, please join me for welcoming Mr. Tobias Harris.
Wow, thank you, Hiroki, for really a truly kind introduction. And of course, I mean, it's really a pleasure, and I appreciate the invitation. And thank you to all your sponsors for making this possible. And I did notice on the attendee list at least another member of our cohort of the Mansfield Network. So, it's good to have a little gathering here, and I'm just truly grateful. Before I really launch into my remarks, I just want to start with a little story because something you said in the introduction reminded me of it. You noted how Prime Minister Abe was not known for his charisma. and either putting people to sleep or making people angry. And so back in 2012, I was in Japan on a Fulbright and doing some graduate research. And at that point, Abe had been, his resignation as prime minister was almost 5 years in the past. And this was early summer of 2012. And I got an invitation to go see him speak on a weekend afternoon. And then, this was back during post 3/11 Setsuden, and there was no air conditioning, and the room was crowded, but it was hot, and I could not stay awake. Not at all. I like was drifting in and out. The room was hot. I couldn't tell you for the life of me what Abe said that day, which was really unfortunate because less than 3 months after that, he was leader of the LDP again. And then by the end of the year, he was prime minister again. So, it would have been nice to remember that, but, it just goes to show what you're talking about. I mean, that he's not always known as the most captivating speaker. But what I want to talk about in my remarks before we really get into discussion, and I'm sure that Hiroki has some really good questions for me, and I'm sure all of you have some very good questions for me. We're now about 6 months since Abe resigned and was replaced by his chief cabinet secretary, Suga Yoshihide. We are now 6 months to the post-Abe era. And I think there are several features I think that we can already note from the past 6 months that I think illustrate a lot about why Abe was able to survive and perform the way he did for as long as he did. And, so really in some ways, as the post-Abe era goes on, we're going to learn more about Abe himself. So first, what I want to tell you is I want to just point out that one thing that has happened. So Abe left in September. So about a year ago, think back to the start really of the COVID-19 pandemic, early 2020, and Japan got a taste of it early on after the Diamond Princess arrived. And if you look at the approval ratings for the various political parties a year ago, basically what you found was that the LDP had somewhere between 35% and 40%. The opposition Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, the leading opposition party, was maybe at most at 10%. And no particular party at all was around 41 or 42%. And if you looked at the same numbers in the most recent round of polling a year later, you basically see the exact same numbers. And that's despite the fact that you had a pandemic, basically unprecedented economic downturn. You had a change of prime minister. You've had scandals. You've had a lot happen in the last year, and those numbers have not changed at all. And I think that tells you, if there's one fact that you need to know about the Abe years, it is that they coincided with the utter collapse in public support for the opposition. And in general, I think a sense of fatigue on the part of the electorate. And so, election after election, you saw either record low turnout or near record low turnout. Lots of voters stayed home. After a decade, frankly, the first decade of the century saw really high enthusiastic turnout in several elections. You had people turn out for Koizumi in 2005. You had people turn out for the DPJ in 2009. You had the excitement of 2007 when the Democratic Party of Japan won the upper house for the first time. I mean, you had, I think, much more enthusiastic participation. And the last decade has been characterized by that has dried up. And that, I think, was an important enabling factor. Now, a lot of those factors, a lot of the reason for that is in some ways out of Abe's control. I mean, I think, the disappointment of the electorate in the Democratic Party of Japan's time in government, particularly after the 3/11 triple disasters, cannot be understated. They got their turn in government. You had this process where the public began to trust the opposition, was willing to give them a shot, increasingly looked to them as a possible governing party. And then when they were given the opportunity, they just made a number of very serious mistakes. I mean, starting with relations with the United States under Hatoyama in 2009, 2010, then continuing really with several mishandled incidents with China, and then, of course, the 3/11 disasters. And all of that, I think, has made the public extremely wary of supporting the opposition. And that, I think, really has fundamentally changed how basically how the LDP governs, because you did have this period where they did have to worry about losing elections. They really did have to worry about the opposition taking power, because the opposition was making headway and the public was swinging around to their side. And it made them one, I think it made the divisions within the party more costly. But two, I mean, I think it also just, I think, led to a sort of policy paralysis on the part of the government that ended up being self-fulfilling. And during the Abe years, without having to worry about really the opposition ever taking power, that it really played into the hands of Prime Minister Abe, who was able to call an election whenever he wanted to discipline members of his own party, which, if you look at the timing of his election, it was often as much about that as it was about keeping the opposition on the wrong foot. So he was able to, I think, exercise more effective control of his party. Of course, the memories of the LDP having lost power and gone into opposition were relatively fresh. And so I think that also had a disciplining effect on his party. And also, he got lucky that the LDP lost in 2009, and so many people lost or retired after that, that when the LDP came back in 2012, so many new members were elected and owed their elections to Abe, that I think it created a sense of loyalty within the party. And all of that, I think, worked in Abe's favor once he was back in power. And so basically, he was in a position where he could govern, if not without constraint. I mean, he was still constrained by a coalition with Komeito, he was still constrained by public opinion, but it definitely gave him a lot more room for maneuver, a lot more margin for error, to take risks on something like, for example, collective self-defense, maybe in a way that might be harder if the political system were more competitive. And it just meant more stability and more predictability in policymaking when Abe wasn't taking risks, because you just did not have this looming challenge of an opposition party. And I think what we've seen since Suga took over is exactly the same. I mean, Suga has looked very vulnerable on a number of fronts. It feels like every news cycle brings some more bad news for him. And yet, his numbers are down from where they were when he started, but basically he's not, I mean, they've stabilized, and he does not look nearly as vulnerable as I think people feared. I mean, I think there's still certainly a pathway for him to win another term, a full term as LDP leader in September, when there's an LDP leadership election, and possibly lead the LDP into a general election. I mean, we could talk about the extent to which he's at risk and why the LDP might want to change leaders. That's certainly possible. But the fact is, the structural factors that enabled Abe to last as long as they did still seem salient. The second thing I think we've learned over the last 6 months or so, that what we've learned about the Abe years, is really that we've seen a new way of governing Japan that really emerged during the Abe years. That, for a long time, you had reformers who wanted to change relations between politicians and bureaucrats. They said the bureaucrats were in charge for too long, and that you had to change the system. You needed to put more power in the hands of elected politicians and the leader, the prime minister, and the people in the cabinet. And I think what you've seen, you still had politicians, Abe and Suga, both in their ways, stressed political control. But what you actually have gotten is a kind of synthesis at the very top, where you have what in other contexts is sometimes called a core executive. You have bureaucrats who are now very closely attuned to what the politicians want. The politicians are able to handpick kind of officials from different ministries that they want. During the Abe years, we saw Meti playing a particularly strong role in the prime minister's office, for example. And so you have this kind of synthesis where you do get bureaucrats, but they're not necessarily wedded to the views of their home ministry. They're part sort of a cadre of officials in the prime minister's office, and they're really able to set the direction of the government in lots of ways. And the other part of this synthesis is that one of the early reforms that you saw during the Abe years, and which in many ways was the culmination of several decades of attempts to reform and strengthen political control of the bureaucracy, was the creation of a cabinet personnel bureau, which sounds like a sort of innocuous technical thing, but in practice it meant that the prime minister, the chief cabinet secretary, had the formal power to appoint the top 500 or so bureaucrats, maybe even more than that, across the government, the highest officials in ministries throughout the government. So instead of looking either to the LDP's backbenches or to the personnel departments of those ministries, the prime minister's office would have a say and would be able to pick its hand-chosen candidates. And on the plus side, it meant that you were going to get more responsive officials. You're going to have officials who really are sensitive and want to please their political masters. I think we've also seen the downside of that, which is that those bureaucrats want to please their political masters, which often means either skirting or fudging or outright violating ethics rules. And we saw scandals like this during the Abe years. We're seeing, I don't know if it deserves the term scandal yet, but controversy involving meals out paid for by Suga's son, who's a telecom executive, with some officials from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications. That is very much a product of this reform, of this attempt to really make sure that bureaucrats know that their job is to please their political masters. And clearly, in a number of cases, that's gone too far. And we'll have to see if there's a correction on that front. But I think it is a real change. It is a durable change to how Japan's governed. And it's something that we all need to be aware of. A third, I think, important change that I think really has become apparent now that you have a new prime minister, that is the ways in which Japan changed Abe's role in the region and really made Japan a regional leader in a way that it hadn't really ever been before. And it's particularly apparent because you have Abe was someone who had really been interested in foreign affairs for a long time. He'd been his father's secretary when he was foreign minister under Prime Minister Nakasone. It was an area he specialized in after he first was elected to the Diet in 1993. This is something that is just, if we were to list the issues Abe cares about most, foreign affairs is pretty high on that list. Suga is not someone like that. There's not a lot of foreign affairs expertise or experience in his background, very much domestic policy focused. And yet, I think under his leadership, you're seeing that essentially a strategy that was laid out and implemented during the Abe years is basically carrying on under a new prime minister without Abe's strengths as a foreign policy leader. And it really does suggest that there is something different about Japan's role. I mean, Japan really now, in a number of ways, has really become an agenda setter in the region. I mean, we're seeing how, for example, the Quad, which was an idea in many ways that was conceived in Tokyo and really pushed forward by Tokyo, is now being embraced by a second U.S. administration, one very different than the last U.S. administration, but one that's still very much committed to that idea. You're seeing Japan really as an agenda setter on trade and trade integration in East Asia. And now the issue, of course, is how to expand the CPTPP. But under Abe, Abe first brought Japan in and then brought TPP back to life as the CPTPP after the U.S. left. That, I think, is continuing. Japan really, I think, continues to set the economic agenda in a lot of other respects. Infrastructure investment as a counterbalance to the Belt and Road Initiative, supply chain rebalancing, something, again, that we've seen the Biden administration embrace. All of that, you have Japan really articulating ideas for a regional framework, the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, as an alternative to a China-centered regional order. And Japan really is at the heart of making that happen and moving that agenda forward and building the kind of relationships with countries across the region that it needs to. I mean, we saw Prime Minister Suga's first foreign trip was to Vietnam and Indonesia, which was, with the exception, I mean, Abe in 2013 also included Thailand, but basically had the same itinerary. And it really shows you a continuity from Abe to Suga as far as foreign policy is concerned. And we're also, I think, getting a look. I mean, this is not just about Japan being a leader on its own, but it's also Japan committed to finding ways to ensure that the U.S. remains committed to Asia's security, building a political order and an economic order. And we're seeing that although there's a new U.S. administration, and things are different, that Suga and the Suga cabinet is still just as committed to building ensuring you're pursuing that vision of U.S.-Japan cooperation as part of this effort to build a regional order. And that work is going on and probably going to go forward maybe a little smoother with fewer, just less nail biting about what meetings between the leaders are going to be. And we'll, I think, get a better glimpse at what that's going to look like later this month when it looks like both the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense will be in Japan and South Korea later this month. So all of that, I think, goes to show the ways in which the Abe government really set Japan on a course and Suga is really just carrying on that work. We could say many of the same things about economic policy. I don't want to go too much longer, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about there. But one of the things that we have noticed is the ways in which the decisions Abe made, both on fiscal policy, this kind of, we're going to spend a lot to ensure growth in the near term and push the goal of fiscal sustainability down the road, and we'll deal with it eventually. That pattern, I think, remains very much in play, if not more so, after the deficit spending we've seen over the last year. That is going to limit options for the governments going forward. It's very hard to deviate from that, and very much the same on monetary policy. I mean, yes, there's a BOJ policy review going on right now. The BOJ is pretty much locked in to a commitment to general, let's say, structural easing. I mean, it might not be pushing policy in dramatically new directions, but it's also not exactly going to stop providing an accommodative environment for the Japanese currency and for the money supply that we've seen over the better part of the last decade. I want to make one final point before going to Q&A, and that's also one other thing that we've learned from the Suga years, or from the Suga months, I should say, about the Abe years. And that is, it was also a time of missed opportunities. And that for all the political strength and all the institutional strength that Abe accumulated, he actually was very risk averse, and I think left a lot of opportunities out there that in retrospect, I think will look like major wasted opportunities. And the most obvious one in my mind is climate. Abe was easily, for most of his term, really the strongest leader in the G7. You had other leaders in the G7 that were facing some pretty significant domestic challenges, were not able to really pick up the mantle of global leadership. And, if any leader could have run with the issue of climate change and really led on the issue of climate change, particularly after Paris was done, it would have been Abe. I mean, he could have said, Japan is going to have its own Green New Deal at home. That's going to be Abenomics 2.0 or 3.0, whatever number they were on at that point. And Abe generally didn't. I mean, he really said the right things about climate change, but didn't do it. And what we saw a month after Suga became prime minister, of course, was a pledge, by 2050 to achieve net zero carbon emissions for Japan, which goes to show that if Abe had wanted to do it, I think he could have. I think, but he had to have the political will, and I think he didn't. And so I think, in 10 or 15, 20 years, the way climate change is going, I mean, unless there's a dramatic breakthrough, when people look back to the Abe years, they're going to think, well, why didn't he do more to head off this challenge? That everyone knew was coming. He had the strength. He led a major carbon emitter. Why couldn't he have done more, whether to set a global example or to set the global agenda, or at least to move the agenda forward at home? And so it's also a story. It's not just the story of the things he achieved. It's also the story of what he did not do with the power that he had. And with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to Hiroki, whatever questions you have, and anything from the audience. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Please, if you have any question or anything to discuss, you want to discuss, please write it in either chat or in Q&A box. I prefer a Q&A, but I try to get the question as much as possible written in either a chat or a Q&A box. So, well, actually, first question that I have is, let's see, so that's Prime Minister Suga now. So it's now from Abe to Suga. And Abe was popular or had enjoyed a higher reputation in foreign policy making than domestic policy making. There are many decisions made for domestic policy. Are controversial. So, so when Suga became prime minister, actually I'd say people are more concerned with his handling of foreign policy, because his predecessor was very popular and then also highly praised for his foreign policy. At the same time, Mr. Suga didn't have a lot of foreign policy making experience. In the meantime, I heard that many people say that, well, Mr. Suga would listen to other people more. So, and then Mr. Abe. And then, so more people actually worry about foreign policy making, and more people had a high expectation, high hope for Suga administration's domestic policy making. But it seems actually a little bit opposite right now. So Suga administration is like stalling, or it's like really like a rocky road for domestic policy making. In the meantime, I don't see any big problem in his foreign policy making so far. So why did this happen? Like so original expectation, and now what has happened for last few months since Suga administration started? What made this like a discrepancy between expectation and the reality?
I mean, it starts with the pandemic, right? And you know that, and I mean, in some ways, it seems puzzling that, I mean, in particular, that Suga seems to have made the same mistakes that Abe did, and you know, it really wasn't until the pandemic that Abe's approval ratings really fell and showed no sign of reversing. Of course, it wasn't really the direct factor for his resignation, but you know, from about May onwards, I mean, he was 20 or 30 points underwater in his net approval ratings. And part of that was just that this crisis came along and the decision-making apparatus stopped working well, and the communication apparatus stopped working well. I mean, Abe, I think, really struggled to decide how to address the pandemic and how to balance economic concerns and public health concerns. And I think at every juncture was struggling to explain what he was doing and why. And so, that was certainly, I think, a factor in his decline last year. And the remarkable thing is that at least until maybe very recently, Suga was making the exact same mistakes. I mean, very much, being very stubborn about not wanting to harm the economy, which is understandable. And it's something that leaders all over the world, frankly, are struggling with. How do you find that balance? Really, hearing things from medical experts, but not necessarily wanting to defer to them entirely. Lots of pressure from the other direction, from business interests, the most obvious one being the tourism industry, which was concerned about what would happen if you stopped the domestic travel subsidies. So all of that, that there was a sort of a paralysis, as the third wave really started to crest. Or not even, I mean, it took a long time to crest, but in November and December, as case numbers were rising, that there was this stubbornness or this reluctance in the government to get ahead of it, to act quickly and decisively, and to really move on that front. And I think that really explains why Suga's numbers really dived after he took office. He had some really strong approval ratings, but obviously the fact that disapproval of his handling of the pandemic rose sharply, that really explains what happened. And it's obviously the number one domestic policy agenda. Everything flows from that. If he can't get the pandemic response right, if things don't improve, if they can't get the vaccine rollout right, clearly, I think it will have some pretty dire implications for his political future. So that explains it. I mean, lots of leaders are struggling. I think it does show his limitations as a communicator. It was one thing, like, yes, he was sort of the voice of the government for almost 8 years as chief cabinet secretary, and giving his daily press conferences. But it's one thing to be delivering a message on behalf of another leader, and it's another thing to be the leader that people are looking for clarity, for vision, for decisiveness. And I think in that seat, I don't think he has shown that he quite has that skill set. Which I think even before he became prime minister, the assumption was that he didn't want it, or he was ill-suited for it. Partly because of that. I mean, he just didn't appear to have the communication skill sets that I think a prime minister in the 21st century is expected to have. And so far, I mean, I think that has borne out. It's not necessarily crippling, but I think it has made his work harder. I think on foreign policy, I mean, so far things have been okay. I mean, I think it helped. The transition from Trump to Biden helped, at least taking one issue off the agenda. I mean, I think had you had Trump reelected, the question of what Japan would do about host nation support and the negotiations that were kind of looming over the Japanese government during the final days of the Trump administration. Clearly, that issue has been sidestepped. You had an agreement that basically kicks the can forward down, kicks the can down the road for another year. That took a pretty sticky foreign policy situation off the table. I think things could get harder. Abe was pretty good. And you mentioned Abe being the rare leader who had good relations with Obama and Trump. He was also the rare leader who was managing to walk a tightrope between China and the United States at a time where you had a trade war and growing friction between the United States and China. That's going to be harder going forward, I think. That I don't know if we're at a tipping point as far as Japan's relationship with China is concerned, but I think between Hong Kong and Xinjiang and what's happening in the East China Sea, I mean, all of this is making it harder, I think, to go back to where things were about a year ago, before the pandemic started and it looked like Xi Jinping was coming to Japan. That visit is off, but whether you're going to have the kind of approach to China that made that possible and a desire to get the relationship right, if only to keep the economic relationship on a stable footing, even that is looking increasingly difficult given what the agenda looks like and given the kind of messaging that we're hearing out of the US government, what we're hearing on Taiwan. And so all of that, I think, is going to make it harder for Suga or whoever comes after Suga to walk the tightrope that Abe was able to walk during his time. But I think you're right. I mean, I think so far, it's been, I think, almost on autopilot on foreign policy. I mean, which is not necessarily a bad thing because right now, that in some ways is what's expected. You know the map, the roadmap to follow. Just a matter of executing and following through on that and making sure that the work to carry it out is getting done, and it seems like it is. So that's how I would answer that question.
Great, thank you. Very comprehensive answer. That is as usually I hear from Tobias, so thank you. Well, actually, one question coming up is, will the Olympic game, Tokyo Olympics, be held? It was asked like a bit provocatively. So are they really serious about Olympics? Yeah.
I think at this point, I think it's pretty likely that it's going to happen. The one question mark being, I mean, if you look at what happened last year and what really made the difference, it was when major national committee said that they weren't going to send their athletes. So the U.S. saying we're not sending our athletes because of the pandemic. I mean, that made it very hard to go forward. I don't think we're hearing anything like that this year. I just don't know where the there's a lot of pressure pushing in favor of having the games. There's not so much pushback coming the other direction. And so, I think the Japanese public, other things being equal, would prefer not to have it. Is it going to be something that's going to break the government? I don't think so. I think it's going to be a very unusual Olympic Games. It'll be very much a televised spectacle. I think, to the extent that there are audiences, they will be exclusively or nearly exclusively domestic. They will, we saw last year the kind of limitations that were placed on spectators at sporting events in Japan, with J League and baseball. I'm sure you'll see restrictions like that on the kind of behavior and, respect for the 3 Cs. But all of that, I think, that being said, I mean, I think they're going to want to get it done. I think the IOC is going to want to get it done. Certainly the Japanese National Committee wants to get it done. The Japanese government seems to want it done. So, I think, it'll be kind of by the skin of their teeth and hoping that, even just having the athletes come doesn't lead to a new outbreak. But, between that and hopefully the vaccination rates will climb, I suspect, at this point, I think they're going to happen.
Good. Interesting. So a few policy questions coming in, but before that, I'd like to take a question from my colleague, Diana Newton, professor of practice of the SMU Tower Center. So she asks, can Mr. Suga survive? So what's his likelihood of remaining as prime minister? And Please tell us who might be his likely competition for the role.
If I were to put numbers on his survival at this point, if you had asked me a few weeks ago, I would say probably worse than 50-50. If I had to say now, I mean, at most maybe a 60% chance. I mean, still probably looking at like a coin flip. I mean, you know, right now, you know, he's doing work that had to get done, which is managing the pandemic, you know, getting Japan through the Olympics. And that's the work that needs to be done. I don't think anyone else wants to do it. It's a thankless job. But you're going to get to September when the LDP has to have an election, and there's going to be a lot of thinking, particularly if you haven't had a snap election yet. There has to be an election a general election by October of this year. The LDP is going to be thinking very hard about the kind of leaders they're going to be going into an election campaign with. And if he can't basically reverse his fortunes, show that you're getting, you know, maybe not a flashy leader, but one who can get things done. And most importantly, at this point, getting vaccines distributed with minimal disruption. That's going to be, you know, it's going to be very hard for the LDP to stick with him. A pretty important test is coming up next month, where you have by-elections, 2 by-elections for the upper house and 1 for the lower house. If the LDP does not make a good showing in those by-elections, I would say the chances of Suga's survival will plummet. I mean, maybe they'll let him make it till September, but there'll be, I think, a pretty strong push to find someone else who can take over, and then basically the first task would be to call a general election and lead the LDP into an election campaign. So you know, there's a lot of open questions, I think, to answer that question properly. You know, but I think, you know, working in his favor, you know, I think there's not much appetite for Japan to return to the revolving door as far as the public is concerned. You know, the fact that you don't have an opposition party that, you know, that really is threatening. I mean, you know, they might win some seats on the margins, and that really is the key issue. You know, just how many seats on the margins would they win in a general election? But they're not a threat to take power. So that also gives Suga a little more breathing room than he might have had otherwise. And, you know, that there are the potential leaders waiting in the wings, but they have their vulnerabilities, and it really is a question of who's going to be able to cobble together a winning coalition of factions and of LDP members to really unseat a sitting prime minister party leader. And so if his fortunes improve, just incumbency and inertia probably are going to work in his favor. If he can't, I mean, if things get worse, if the vaccination campaign's a mess, if there are more scandals, if his numbers keep falling, then I have to think that the first choice, the most likely successor, is going to be, I guess now Administrative Reform Minister Kono. You know, that he has, I mean, not without liabilities, and I think. I don't know how much his fellow LDP Diet members love him for various reasons, although they love him more than, say, someone like Ishiba. But, you know, he's someone he's a bit quirky. In the past, you know, before he was given serious ministerial responsibilities, you know, he was usually described as a maverick. He's got a very active social media presence. All of that makes him a little different. And, you know, sometimes, you know, when the LDP feels at risk approaching an election, sometimes they might be willing to take a gamble on someone who's a little different, who might connect with voters in a way that a more boring candidate like Suga might. I mean, for lack of a better term, something that, you know, someone like Suga might lack. They might turn to someone like Kono to get voters excited, and ride his coattails to a robust mandate. So it's certainly possible to see that scenario happening as well. That you would see, you know, Kono take the reins in September, call a snap election, enjoy sort of that early flourish of support, and convert that into an electoral victory in October.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned about Mr. Kono, and then so Suga administration put him in the position of in charge of reforms, And so one question from Helmut Ludwig asking the perspective of Suga administration's stance for economic reform, opening Japanese markets, and here I would add the digitalization of economy, as well as how serious do you think is the Suga administration's stance for reforms? And so how do you think?
It's a great question. One thing that I emphasize in the book, and I think also is a key to understanding the Suga administration as well, is that for all the, there was the kind of talk in the international press about Abe as a neoliberal reformer, and the third arrow being about reform, and Abe played this up, when he would speak to foreign audiences in London or New York. The reality is that the key theme for Abe, as far as the third arrow is concerned, was not reform. It was actually kind of just industrial policy again. It was the Abe government was going to set, was trying to move economic activity into growth areas, into areas that were higher productivity. Part of the third arrow was also finding ways of making more workers, or importing more workers, or doing more with the workers you already have. But setting that aside, a lot of it was, what can the Japanese government do to channel economic activity in more productive ways? So deregulation was part of that. Reform was part of it, but it was just a tool as part of a bigger toolbox. There were a lot of other tools, subsidies, tax incentives, trade agreements. I mean, all of that. There's sort of this big package. And so, Abe was not a reformer. And I would say that what we're seeing from Suga, both what we saw during his tenure and his work as chief cabinet secretary, and what we've seen of him since becoming prime minister and during the campaign to become LDP leader, is the same type of approach. And the kind of emphasis on digitalizing Japan's economy and doing the work that hadn't been done yet is very much a state-led initiative to move economic activity in a more productive direction that it hadn't, that previous governments had failed to achieve. Suga's own kind of Green New Deal that we've seen him unveil, very much the same direction. I mean, they're trying to find different levers to move, to move economic activity in the direction of sustainability, but also in that sense, profitability, that these are growth areas, and that they're going to use a number of different tools to push economic activity in different directions. And so it still is, it's statism. I mean, that was, really, I think one of the key words for understanding Abe is a statist as much as he is a nationalist. I mean, very much about, the responsibilities of the Japanese state to ensure the security and the prosperity for the Japanese nation in the future, and making sure the state had those abilities. And so a lot of the reforms I mentioned in my remarks were geared towards that, the institutional reforms, I should say. And Suga is, I think, very much in the same vein, very much a statist, very much about trying to find a way to maximize, to use the state to maximize the prosperity of the Japanese people.
Thank you. A question about the relationship between prime minister and bureaucracy raised by Mr. Yoshimura-san, head of the Sumitomo Shoji Washington office. So he said, so Abe preferred a strong grip on bureaucrats and somehow resembling a political appointee system. So is that a good thing for Japan, where sometimes bureaucrats purportedly does not obey their ministers? There are pros and cons about keeping a tight grip. So one is a kind of normative question. Is it a good thing that how Abe handled the bureaucracy? And then secondly, how would Suga be similar or different from Abe in terms of the prime minister's relationship with the bureaucrats?
That is a great question, or a great set of questions, rather. On the normative question, I mean, clearly, on the one hand, when voters choose their elected representatives, I mean, it's no good to have a situation where elected representatives can't do what they've promised voters they were going to do because bureaucrats want to do their own thing. This was what a lot of my graduate research was on. I mean, it's an area that I've always been fascinated on, and how you, how do bureaucrats make sure their expertise is respected and incorporated, but how do the politicians also do what they said they were going to do? But clearly there are risks, and clearly, I do think in the various scandals that we saw during the latter part of Abe's years, that if bureaucrats know that the thing they have to do to get ahead is please the political masters of the moment, that's not exactly a setup for ethical policymaking. Policymaking that serves the public as opposed to the representatives of the public, who are not necessarily interchangeable. And that, I think, really requires strong watchdogs. And in some ways, what the scandals have revealed is that Japan has moved to a more Westminster style system, where you have essentially a prime minister that could act as an elected dictator, as people once referred to Margaret Thatcher as. That if a prime minister has a parliamentary majority, there's very little standing in the prime minister's way. But if you're going to have a prime minister with that kind of power, the rest of the system actually needs to catch up. You need independent watchdogs, whether that's inspectors general or just stronger investigatory powers on the part of the Diet. I mean, obviously right now you don't have that, but there needs to be some correctives in the system, so that there is accountability, and that when there are missteps, and there is malfeasance, that there's some sort of correction. I mean, I think we've seen the media trying to play that role, and I mean, clearly, the various scandals have been uncovered. But the Diet, I mean, you get lots of questions in the Diet. I don't know if it's an actual oversight function. And so, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, I think, on the machinery of Japanese democracy, that if you are going to have a stronger top-down system, a stronger prime minister, you've got to work. There's got to be ways. It doesn't have to be full, checks and balances like what you have in the United States. You don't want to go all the way towards immobilism like Japan has been described as being in the past. But you do need to find a way of monitoring what the government is doing, what the executive is doing. And I don't think Japan is there yet. I guess maybe I answered both questions sort of in that response. What was the less normative part of that? Can you
how would Suga be different from Abe?
I mean, if anything, he'll be even more committed. I mean, given that Suga was in some ways the enforcer of the Abe government's attempts to control the bureaucracy. I mean, back to the first days of the Abe government, I mean, Suga was the one who called all the administrative vice ministers together and said, I'm to be consulted on all personnel decisions. You're coming to me first. Before they'd even created a cabinet personnel bureau, he was making clear that the cabinet was going to control senior personnel decisions. Clearly he's committed to this. I mean, if you look at, I don't know how many people have actually read the book that he published back in 2011 or 2012. I did, and I feel sorry for anyone else who did, because it is a very dry book, but he does lay out his philosophy of how politicians should interact with the bureaucracy, and he it's very much about politicians using the expertise of the bureaucracy, but ultimately the bureaucrats have to serve the politicians and do what the politicians want them to do. So that you're not going to see, I think, a change in philosophy as far as how the political leadership of Japan should relate to the bureaucracy. But we have already seen, I mean, the same thing that we saw during the Abe years, where there were bureaucrats who were favored by the politicians and therefore actually wielded quite a lot of power within the prime minister's office, and that remains very true now. So it's not, it's too simple to say that it's politicians controlling bureaucrats, or politicians are making policy and bureaucrats are just sort of following along. I mean, there are, bureaucrats, either career bureaucrats or retired bureaucrats, who are involved in the policymaking process, making key decisions in the Kante itself. And that remains, I think, very much the case under Suga.
Okay, great. Actually, it's your talk is very exciting. So I forgot the time, but we are approaching to 7:30 in Dallas time. So I'd like to bundle up quite a few questions. So questions are basically regarding the issues. So there are, I would say, 3 foreign policy issue questions and 3 more domestic issues. So you can selectively answer the questions. So let me raise the 3 foreign policy questions. So how about Korea? Both South Korea, North Korea. Is there any perspective of improving? Under Suga. So another thing is, of course, China. And then, of course, this is actually difficult. You mentioned a little bit about it. So Biden administration's China policy doesn't change much from Trump, although I think the means would be different. You know, maybe in the United States demands Japan to follow U.S.-China policy, and then that's some of the policies Japan cannot follow the U.S. position, such as a decoupling. That's actually very difficult for Japan to follow. So you know, how about Suga's China policy, and how would it be different from Abe's China policy? And then third issue area is Southeast Asia. I think that Southeast Asia is increasingly important for Japanese foreign policy, especially to handle both the U.S. and China. So those 3 issue areas: Korean Peninsula, China, and then as well as Southeast Asia. Domestic side is one is our Tower Center Forum member Wayne Trimmer asked a question of how about the Okinawa base issue. Is there any, do you have any perspective? Second issue area is gender equality. So recently, the chairman of the Japanese Olympic Committee made a sexist comment, and then he was replaced with Seiko Hashimoto, former speed skater. So how about the Suga administration's position for gender equality? And then the third one is how about the constitutional amendment? So what is the Suga's position? So kind of 3 foreign policy issue areas, 3 domestic policy issue areas. So
yeah. This is going to be sort of the lightning round. I have 3 minutes to cover. Well,
we can do a little bit overtime. So.
I could probably talk for as long as I've talked already about the challenges with the Koreas. It's a huge challenge. It is clearly it's a priority for the Biden administration to try to get Japan and South Korea talking again and get trilateral cooperation going again. The relationship with South Korea, though, as far as Japan is concerned, I think it does come down to a single word, and that is trust. I think the Abe government looked at the transition from Park Geun-hye to Moon Jae-in, and they've watched how the Moon administration has acted, and they do not trust Moon's behavior, Moon as a good faith interlocutor as far as Japan is concerned. I think they saw Moon basically gut the agreement that Abe had signed in 2015 on restitution for the comfort women. I think they see people around Moon as being opposed to the 1965 treaty between Japan and South Korea, basically the constitution for the bilateral relationship, and really wanting to break away from that. You've seen these court cases, and which aren't directly a responsibility of the Moon administration, but the administration also does not, I think, is constrained from doing anything about it anyway. All of that means that I think it's very hard for the Suga administration to take the Moon administration at its word. And so this week, again, we heard President Moon say that he wants to look forward with Japan and find a way forward. And the response immediately from Japan is, we want action, not words. And so, that there is just a lack of trust there that's going to be very hard to repair, and it's going to really take a lot of work. And I think Japan wants, when they say they want action, I mean they want South Korea to cave, and to really change course on how they've approached these questions of his restitution from Japan towards South Korea. We could go a lot more into that. I'm not going to right now, because at some point we're going to have to end. On North Korea, I mean, same thing. North Korea, of course, was not interested in talking with Abe, even as they talked to everyone else and talked to Kim Jong-un went to China several times, talked to Trump a couple of times, talked to Moon. No interest in talking with Abe, even after Abe said that he would meet without preconditions. The major issue, of course, remains resolving the abductees. Ultimately, I mean, I don't think there's really much Japan can do about it. I mean, they're basically left waiting for a change of heart in North Korea. And as long as I think North Korea has potentially willing partners, certainly in Beijing and also in Seoul, and maybe the United States, for at least talking and extracting economic concessions. I mean, so far, I don't know if we can say that about the Biden administration yet, but possibly. Japan is down the list as a potential negotiating partner, because I think North Korea can look elsewhere. So until North Korea feels that the well is dry in other places, and that then can maybe look to Japan to try to extract some financial concessions, I don't think you're going to see a lot of movement between Japan and North Korea. China, again, we could talk for another hour about where Japan's relationship with China is right now and where it's going. I think there's still an attempt to try to keep things on an even keel. But the question is going to be what happens when the pandemic ends and travel resumes. Is Japan going to continue to look to China as a source of tourism, of labor, of foreign students coming to Japan? Because that really was really the story of the Abe years. That Japan was opening to the world in new ways, and in practice that meant a lot of Chinese money coming to Japan. And so, I don't think, from the business community, I don't think there's an appetite for decoupling. I think there's an appetite for hedging, but we've seen that for the better part of the last decade. So that certainly is continuing. That really is the major counterweight in the relationship. But right now, because economic ties are frozen, the other interests, I think, are at least a lot more vocal and are getting more of a hearing. So you're hearing more, about kind of resistance to what China's doing in Hong Kong. You're hearing a lot more about, the Coast Guard law and what China's doing in the East China Sea. You're hearing a lot more about Xinjiang in Japan, which is unusual given that human rights has never really been a paramount concern as far as Japan's China policy is concerned. So whether that changes when things return to, or when we move into the post-corona period, remains to be seen. But right now, I mean, things look, the possibility for Japan moving in a different direction on China policy seems greater now than it has really in quite some time. Southeast Asia, I mean, there's not that much more to say than what I've said. I mean, I think it really is, in many ways, it's really the key focus of Japan's Asia policy. I mean, they look at Southeast Asia, they see an area where, an opportunity for Japan to grow in the future, a place where Japan really has to be invested in, a place where they really need to provide countries with an alternative to Chinese investment and to potential Chinese political domination. And so it's going to remain kind of the central arena in many respects for Japan's Asia policy, a place where they're going to look for trading partnerships, major recipients of aid, official and private investment. I mean, all of that is still going to be there. A lot of the work that the Quad does is going to be geared at relations with various Southeast Asian countries, if not with ASEAN as a whole, because you can't really expect ASEAN as a whole to necessarily agree on all of these issues. So all of that, I think, is going to continue under Suga and beyond. Okinawa bases, a lot of continuity. I mean, Suga did a lot of the work during the Abe years, moving the relocation plan forward. It's still kind of in this limbo where it's kind of moving forward, but there's still political challenges on the ground, and there's still the public in Okinawa is still opposed. I mean, it's unfortunate, and it would be nice if we could have a plan that really made the Okinawans feel like they had a greater say in the destiny of their island and a greater say in the disposition of U.S. forces based there. But Suga is not going to be the leader who gives that to the Okinawans. I mean, and in some ways, the fact that the LDP has had such little success in Okinawa, it paradoxically, or maybe we should expect this, that it'd be one thing if the LDP stood a chance of winning some elections in Okinawa, but given that the party is not running or has not run well and has lost most races and certainly lost the gubernatorial races, that the LDP I think in some ways can write off the prefecture. I mean that they've this is the plan, this is what we're going to do, you've got to accept it, you're not going to vote for us anyway. So that to some extent seems to be where we're at as far as Okinawa is concerned. Gender equality, this is something that Suga has not talked about all that much. I think it's sort of floating there on the agenda. Certainly an issue he inherited. His cabinet was not exactly full of talented female politicians. Not that there are that many to go around in the LDP, unfortunately. But I think the real challenge with gender equality, and this is bigger than the Suga government, and that is just as Japan moves into the post COVID-19 world, not unlike the United States and a lot of other places. I mean, women really suffered most of all, and really were forced out of the workforce. And you had seen a great deal of progress, at least on getting women in the workforce, to stay in the workforce during the Abe years. Female participation actually rose to a level higher than the United States during the Abe years. It has been not an easy year, I think, for working women pretty much anywhere in the world. And so going forward, as the economic system recovers from the pandemic, whether you're able to regain that and whether you're actually able to build on some of the positive side, I guess, we've seen of the pandemic, that you have telework in Japan in a way that you've never had before, which might, enable more flexible working styles. I mean, it's quite possible that we've seen more reform just by necessity over the last year than we saw during the 3 years that the Abe government was trying to introduce working styles reform. And so to the extent that that stays, it remains a factor, remains a feature of Japanese workplaces going forward, that possibly, that working women in Japan will find themselves in a better situation subsequently, but that remains to be seen, and it's definitely something that's going to have to be worked on going forward. Finally, constitution revision. I was always doubtful that even after the LDP supposedly got its 2/3 majority in the upper house, that it was ever going to happen, at least under Abe's watch. It did not happen on Abe's watch. So I called that one right. There's so much on the agenda now that I don't think Suga is going to spend any political capital whatsoever to move this forward. I mean, there's just too much going on. And it is just, the gains are too little, the risks are too great. It would require really having a fight out with Komeito, which the LDP really, I think, cannot afford to have at this moment. So for the foreseeable future, I do not see constitution revision being much of a factor, if any, on the political agenda. That took me about 10 minutes.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great lecture about the important issues of Japanese politics. And thank you very much, Tobias. I think that Bora put the website, the PDF link to his book discount from Oxford University Press. This is actually a topic that is increasingly important. So when I was reading his book, I thought that so the last 8 years, when Prime Minister Abe was the Prime Minister, that was a period of time when the world expectation to Japan has changed. So in the past, Japan was just a follower of the United States. But for the for the reason of what happened, both in the United States and China. Japan is kind of pushed to the central stage, center of the stage, whether the Japanese like it or not. So that's actually how it is. And then I think that Abe fit that like new conditions quite well. And then we'll see how Suga will handle that like a new world and a new expectation to Japan. I don't think that expectation that like the conditions of the world will change soon. So that will continue beyond Suga's term, I think. So I think that this book, again, the Iconoclast, this is a very good to see kind of as a guidebook and to understand Japan's role in that new world. So please join me for thanking Tobias Harris.
Thank you, Tobias, and thank you so much, Hiroki. Thank you everyone for joining, and please go on our website and look more for our events that we have coming up in March. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hiroki. Thank you for all the questions.
Thank you,
This was
Tobias.
great.